This is Portugal, a poor and fairly weak country, and this is our goal, a global colonial power. But wait, there's a catch. The conquest of Catholic Iberia is forbidden, our great neighbor stays on the map. I will simply reduce it to the role of a poor footstool. How will I achieve that? Very simply, in 5 quick steps, where I will begin with 2 approaches for Portugal. Then Castile will decide our fate, and once everything becomes clear, I will focus on fixing the economy, which I will use for conquest and even greater growth. So welcome imperialist Lucas here. Let's begin. I have to admit that the starts of Portugal and Castile are very similar. In both countries there are plenty of fortifications to remove, which is exactly what I do everywhere except the capital. Beautiful! I even picked the same rivals: Morocco, Granada and Tlemcen. Research. I develop additional burghers as quickly as possible and increase institution growth. Some extra diplomacy will also come in handy, and then we'll see. One advisor will work on shifting values toward communalism, while the other will strengthen the legitimacy. And that's basically where all the similarities between these two countries end. The path forward is completely different. And it largely depends on how we want to play Portugal: more aggressively, where I move quickly to conquer Morocco, or more defensively, where I conquer Granada first. Yes, the classic defensive Lucas playstyle, conquering less than usual. And then nothing, for the next 50 years even. And honestly, after the recent vassal nerf, by which I mainly mean that vassals are no longer nearly as profitable, and in fact, vassals have now become a very significant expense, I choose the second approach, the defensive one. And if you're currently playing Portugal differently, tell me what results you're getting in the comments. And here, surprisingly, the proper army composition might actually help me. I'll give you a tip right away: these starting armies are randomized. Every time you start a new game, the initial composition is different. And at the beginning, I want cavalry here, because it will be very useful in the first and only war. I also immediately begin improving relations with Castile, because as soon as possible I want to form an alliance with that country, otherwise Castile will most likely conquer me. For the heir to the throne, I immediately look for a wife. She should, of course, be as young as possible. But this time she should also have good stats, because in the current version of the game, the queen becomes a member of our dynasty. So this way, you can acquire a truly excellent advisor. But once again, there's a catch. The problem is that once a spouse becomes queen, she can no longer be appointed as an advisor in the cabinet. The Catholic faith forbids it. However, as long as the heir's wife is still a princess, I can grant her cabinet rights, though at the moment she still belongs to the nobility estate. So if she serves in the cabinet, she will strengthen that estate. But I make her an advisor anyway, which costs me 20 legitimacy. Because she is much better than the current advisor, and after some time, when she becomes queen, she will strengthen my crown authority. The current king can become an admiral and continue pushing the country toward maritime values. And I accelerate this process as well by assigning the heir to the fleet. The budget. If you want to take care of yours, remember that the best place to buy cheap games is ENEBA, the sponsor of this channel. All offers are in the description. Returning to the game though, there isn't much philosophy involved in the budget. I simply automate everything. I increase spending on legitimacy, lower army maintenance, disable the forts for now, and set diplomacy spending to the minimum as well. Time for privileges. At first, I grant only a few privileges, specifically those that increase communalism values. For the clergy, that's simply 2 privileges, and 1 privilege for the peasantry. Then, for the burghers, I grant 1 privilege that will passively increase development, and 1 privilege for the nobility that allows me to tax them more heavily. And now I simply need to increase my legitimacy in the near future. The country is basically ready to play, so I can safely unpause and move on to the next stage, where unfortunately everything depends on Castile's actions. The ideal scenario for this strategy is that Castile does absolutely nothing for the next 2 to 3 years, until your first parliament session. However, Castile very often gets an early event that leads to a war against Morocco. And then, unfortunately, you get dragged into a war you don't actually want. Your goal in that case is to seize as much of Granada and Morocco as possible. If, however, you want to play very aggressively, completely differently from me, then in the first war against Morocco, you simply have to take Fez. Morocco without Fez has its backbone broken and becomes a much easier opponent. But more importantly, in terms of values, you need to move towards serfdom if you want any chance of winning against Morocco. Otherwise, if you don't do that, prepare for lost wars against Morocco. Because that country can very quickly field 40,000 levies, half of which are very powerful cavalry. But that's not the strategy I've chosen. So I'll take a different path. I start by demolishing a few production buildings in the capital, specifically those producing cloth. as Portugal, I won't make money from that. Before long, those goods will simply flood our markets from Castile, which will be producing them on a massive scale. Instead, I will try to sell tools to Castile, because as Portugal, I have iron in several locations. The second commodity I'll focus on later is marble, and the third is salt. Those will essentially form the foundation of my economy. I almost forgot that it's worth starting a spy network in Morocco. Unfortunately, that requires me to increase diplomatic spending a little. 10% should be enough. In the capital, I immediately build more tool workshops, but more importantly, right after that, I want a library to be built here. That means I'll need more books, so a scriptorium goes up first, and later I'll increase paper production as well. And now, for 2 years, I run at maximum speed, waiting either for a Castilian war or for my parliament session. In the meantime, one of Portugal's early events fires regarding the establishment of a university, and whether it should be restored to Lisbon. At the same time, one of the laws concerning centralization or decentralization will be introduced. Personally, I don't think it matters much either way. Shortly afterward, I managed to secure an alliance with Castile, but more importantly, I survive until May 1339, which allows me to convene parliament, and that's without an earlier war against Granada or Morocco. So I guess I've been well behaved. While I'm at it, I'll improve relations with the nobility, because unfortunately those have deteriorated quite a bit, and if you're lucky with your agents, then besides fabricating claims on whom, in my case, it looks like Granada. And while Portugal does need to change several laws, for example, shifting power distribution toward the nobility if you're playing around serfdom, or toward the peasantry if you're playing around free subjects, I still want to improve relations with the nobility. So I'll use the next parliament session to change laws instead. For now, I move on to war with Granada, where I have to admit that I get incredibly lucky. From what I can see, Morocco won its war against Tlemcen but lost its entire army. So I'll try to fight this war on my own at first without Castilian assistance. We can always call them in later. In fact, I'll call Castile into the war mainly to save up on military access once my army is ready to move, because when I bring Castile into the war, I will be able to move through its territory. But now I need to act very quickly and occupy the entire area before the Castilian troops arrive. It's also very important for the ruler to gain the maritime trade, because that pushes us even further toward maritime values. I use the army splitting option to occupy all territories. Beautiful, Granada's army is defeated. I'm the first one on Granada's capital, that's the most important thing. And now I simply need to get here as fast as possible. And honestly, I really am lucky in this run. In none of my test runs did I encounter such a weak Morocco. I now raise my naval levies so I can use them to transport the army. And onto the Portuguese court arrives the future lover of our prince. This woman can really shake things up in Portugal, which happens very quickly because an affair begins. Half a year later, I'm faced with a choice. Either the lover loses her head and my son flees to Sweden, or I temporarily ignore the issue and lose the future alliance with Castile. For me, the choice is simple. We need to get rid of the lover, future Lucas here. I tested this event several more times, and honestly, the only reliable way to prevent it is simply to marry this woman. The consequence of her death is a civil war. But the best part is that while I'm suppressing my rebellion, Castile is occupying Moroccan territory. That gives me a very quick victory. I'll also end the war in a safe way. I don't take any Moroccan territory in Africa. In addition to territory, I take war reparations and maps of the Sahara. Had Morocco not discovered my spies earlier, I would have stolen those maps and been able to take many more maps from Morocco now. I take all of Granada for myself. A bit of money, but more importantly, I steal a huge number of maps of Central Africa from them, and if you want to see exactly what you've discovered, simply click the area's name in the tooltip. The war is over. And fortunately, conquering Granada does not automatically end the alliance with Castile. As for discovering Mali, unfortunately I wasn't able to reveal their capital, so I'll continue stealing maps from Morocco. Returning to Granada, I demolished the captured fortress here. There will definitely be rebellions in this region, and it will be easier to suppress them if the rebels don't control a fortress. But more importantly, I do not release any vassals here, for some reason, when rebellions occur. In provinces owned by vassals, either new minor states emerge, or the territory is transferred directly to Morocco. I even had one run where I released Granada as a vassal, converted its religion and culture, and then the vassal somehow became an independent country. And this only ever happens during my Portugal campaigns. After the war, I also disband the entire army. I won't need those troops anymore, because after conquering Granada, Portugal now enters a very long period of peace. That doesn't mean I'll be bored, it simply means I'll have plenty of other things to do, in order to make Portugal rich and ready for the conquest of Africa. At the same time, I'll also be integrating the newly conquered territories, changing their culture and religion. That will probably take around 100 years, but I'm in no hurry. And yes, you should start by integrating the provinces. I also enact tolerance laws for voluntary workers. To push Portugal toward humanism, as soon as I reached 100 legitimacy, my financial problems disappeared, and I even started making a profit. And if, like me, you have any loans, then getting rid of them should be your first priority. In 1342, the Renaissance era arrived, and for Portugal the choice is really simple. Namely, I choose administrative ideas. Thanks to them, it's possible to achieve very high control throughout all of Portugal. As for further economic development, I basically proceed in the same way. In the capital, I expand tool production or other individual profitable businesses. From time to time, I also develop the RGOs that mine iron for me. It's also a good idea to develop horse production near the capital, and later on the salt mines. The second era also brings new research. In Portugal's case, I initially want to maximize my research speed bonus, so I increase literacy among 3 social classes. Then I'll secure the support of the nobility, which will allow me to tax them more heavily. And just in case, the next step will be improving the levy, because in the meantime Castile will keep dragging me into some stupid wars and I have to respond to them. Fortunately, it's usually strong enough to handle things on its own. But not always. Unfortunately, my King Alfonso died at a very young age, as he was only 52 years old. He was such a great ruler that I built a monument in his honor. After the return of the prodigal son, I decided not to move the capital from Lisbon, because the current capital simply has the best ports and access to the sea, which will later allow me to spread control along the entire coastline. And now look, when Pedro ascended the throne, his wife joined our dynasty and will support the crown. This is genuinely one of the best ways to find good advisors. It would just be nice if she gave birth to more children. Meanwhile, I continue stealing maps from Morocco, especially the map of Mali. And basically, once I have it, I stop spying on Morocco and start spying on Mali instead. When communalism values reached their maximum, I began introducing free subjects. And to speed up that process, I'll now gradually introduce additional privileges, because each one cost me 5 legitimacy points, and improving legitimacy causes my budget to dip into the negative. Yes, the costs are significant, but it's worth it. Fortunately, my foreign queen helps me with this effort. The alliance with Castile is genuinely useful when dealing with potential rebellions in Granada. Thankfully, these revolts aren't particularly difficult. I also improve relations with Sunni countries that could potentially join a coalition against me, because that could unfortunately threaten my alliance with Castile. In the meantime, of course, the Black Death reached me as usual. During it, I will implement the segregation of the infected, which will allow me to reach the maximum level of communalism values. And while the plague is ongoing, I'll also build settlements, so that I can restore the population as quickly as possible afterward. At this stage, a very important milestone is constructing the first governor, or rather, a lieutenancy, which is a special version of the governor available to all countries with Iberian culture. Unlike a governor, it can even be built in a town. However, just like a governor, it must have a road connection to the capital. I placed the first of these buildings in Porto, right next to the iron mine. Unfortunately, these buildings are fairly expensive to maintain because of their gold cost, but after some time they begin paying for themselves as control spreads throughout the surrounding area. And that's exactly why discovering Mali is so important. There is a huge amount of gold on that market. After introducing free subjects, I focused on reaching 50 points of maritime values. This allowed me to enact a new government reform, port administration, which gives me the ability to build a naval governor in Granada, further helping control spread there. Unfortunately, this building can only be constructed in ports that are cities. Fortunately, I happened to conquer some of those. Meanwhile, I kept stealing maps from Mali until I discovered Jollof. And now I begin stealing maps from Jollof because that will reveal this area to me. After some time, I finally begin recovering from the crisis I found myself in after the Black Death. It took quite a while, more than 15 years, but that's thanks to the fact that control now looks much better than it did at the start. Although I have to admit that in Granada I'll also need to build roads, so that control can spread much more effectively there. Returning to Africa, I made a bit of a mistake here. By stealing maps from Jollof, I don't get access to the sea zone. I need to send an expedition there, and that's expensive. So for now I can't afford it, because I constantly need to expand the RGOs tied to my most profitable resources, and only in Lisbon do I continue constructing additional production buildings. But once I start running a larger surplus, my next objective is to build a road to the quarries, specifically to the 2 locations that contain marble. In research, I now also choose cheaper city construction, and just as I was beginning to recover from the previous plague, a new one struck, depriving me of as many as 200,000 people. For a country that is supposed to focus on colonization, that's a genuine tragedy. And now look at how much control jumped after I built roads to the quarries. The next step is constructing bridges, and afterward, in my most profitable rural provinces, I build bailiffs. But pay attention here, to balance them out, it's useful to build a large number of trade villages, because bailiffs strengthen the nobility, while villages strengthen the peasantry. And it's from the peasantry that I collect most of my taxes. Once I started exceeding 60 gold income, I decided to send my first expeditions to discover a sea route to Mali. And yes, these expeditions are really expensive. At roughly the same time I had already integrated all areas of Granada, I now begin cultural assimilation. And here's an important detail: the higher your control, the faster assimilation progresses. It literally says so, at the very bottom of the tooltip. That's why it's worth combining the efforts of 2 advisors. One increases control, while the other assimilates the population. Even so, it will still take decades. It's a good thing this game has so many speed settings and runs so wonderfully fast. Yes, that was sarcasm. And now that my RGOs are making money, it's time to throw more fuel into the furnace of the economy. By increasing demand through the construction of service buildings. Because all of them require goods to operate, most of those goods are simply purchased from the market, and there we go, 100 gold of net income achieved before the year 1400, which I consider quite an accomplishment with this country. The key to that was still having a traditional economy, which allowed me to extract more resources such as iron, from which I profit, marble as well. And in Granada's territory, sugar. As soon as I integrate those lands, saffron too, which will provide another massive injection of cash. I can now also afford to expand the fleet, making my naval presence even stronger. Right afterward, I introduce a professional army. As usual, I first move toward armories, and then follow the standard path of better unit types. Portugal in this era still has upgraded Crusader units available, which I will invest in, as well as supply wagons, because I'll need them. At this point, I've begun putting much more effort into exploration, because securing a foothold in Mali is extremely important for the next stages of the campaign. And with the development of banking, I want to increase my trade range as much as possible, so that I can pull large amounts of gold from Mali, as well as begin early Portuguese colonization. And to make that colonization as effective as possible, Portugal's rise to power requires docks and protected harbors. I also build new towns along Portugal's entire coastline, but not everywhere. I carefully select specific locations, because I don't need that many cities yet. In the end, it looks like this. I skip all the valuable resources along the coast. Most of these towns will receive one of 2 laws, either port rights to increase port capacity, or granary rights, which increase food reserves and therefore population growth. Portugal also has a unique law here that is quite powerful, but I'll only introduce it later in the cities, and once I have my towns, I build armories in them. In fact, I do exactly the same thing along Granada's coastline, just as a secondary priority. The cherry on top is constructing bailiffs in every location with valuable resources. And all of these measures have led to this. Just look at how beautifully control is spreading throughout Portugal. Although yes, there are still locations where control can be improved further. But even now the difference between wealth and the tax base is very small. And sure, at this point Spain is twice as rich as we are, but it has 4 times the population. And it also possesses far more land territory. But we're already entering the phase where we'll soon surpass it, because I've just begun colonizing the Canary Islands. And yes, from this point onward, what lies ahead are simply wars in Africa, the acquisition of new territory and new resources, which will force me to introduce further social reforms. And yes, at the beginning of this stage, I can honestly admit that I'm getting into colonization a bit too late, but only by about 20 years. I also deliberately avoided colonizing in this area, because otherwise, every time a period of peace began, I would be attacked by Morocco. Although no, in this campaign I have to admit that Morocco is very weak, and even I, while pursuing free subjects, have a larger army. If I were going to attack and conquer Morocco, I would do it right now. I would focus on taking the entire coastline for myself, where my governor in Granada would also increase control in those territories. The inland territories I would hand over to a vassal. However, in this campaign I want to try a peaceful approach in order to test these buildings. This approach also allows me to save a huge amount of money on the army and spend that cash on RGOs instead. And now, since I have control in Granada, I build them there as well. But I also don't forget about developing Lisbon, especially its military industry. From time to time I also build trade villages, mainly in locations deeper inland, because ultimately most of these areas will become towns, except for perhaps only 2 iron producing locations. I build trade villages because I want to increase trade capacity. But preferably without strengthening the burghers, I still have to grant a large number of privileges to that estate in order to introduce a capitalist economy. Although for now I have to admit that the traditional economy is performing wonderfully. For such a small country I have quite a respectable tax base. Before that, however, I introduce humanism. An opportunity presented itself. Jolof lost its alliance with Mali and this looks like an easy war. However, for this invasion to succeed I needed several supply carts, because they finally transport meaningful quantities of supplies. I also used parliament to press claims on this country's territory and then immediately declare war. Fortunately, as Portugal, I can still raise a very large fleet of fishing boats at this point, which can supply food by using these options. And I also need to make sure my army has an adequate food supply. Unfortunately, I still can't transport the entire army at once, so 2 expeditions await me. Meanwhile, all of my supply carts remained in Portugal. But fortunately, the food lasted long enough for the supply carts to arrive. Now I need to regroup the army and march into battle, and then lose everything. Fortunately, the second attempt succeeded. During this war, I established diplomatic relations with Mali. They like my weapons so much that they wanted to buy them. I could have refused, which would have greatly strengthened my traditional economy, but it would have damaged relations with that country. So in the end, I decided to provide weapons shipments. Because honestly, all I need is a foothold in that market, so that I can completely take it over before long. I decided to conquer all of Jolo for myself, although I'm not sure whether my strategy will prove to be the best one, because now I'm releasing a custom subject here. From the inland territories, which will become a colonial nation, because I want to capture a portion of their merchants. Besides, a colonial nation always shares our primary culture and religion. Yes, we can still annex it later. And I will transfer all locations to this colony except for those that make up the coastline. Those I keep for myself. Yes, transferring locations involves a lot of clicking. I integrate these individual locations and the process is actually very fast. And that's because the points visible here on the advisor would previously have been divided among the entire province. This way, a single location receives all of them. In this case, I am pushing integration at 3% per month, and essentially, Jolof has allowed me to continue colonizing because it extends my range. Although this particular coastline is a trap, because there is a substantial local population here, and establishing a colony would take decades. Besides, colonies are still too expensive for my taste, at least for Portugal. Generally speaking, they aren't expensive. And finally, after almost 100 years of gameplay, I have access to gold from Niani, which is incredibly cheap. For me, the price is 3 times higher. Now I just need to take over that market. That's why I now expand my fleet. With Iberian merchant ships, 10 should be enough to start with. Next, I build towns along the entire coastline in the locations I kept for myself. And then, in all of those towns, I grant port rights. After granting port rights, I basically build only 2 things: libraries and marketplaces. Libraries to acquire workers more quickly, and marketplaces, of course, to dominate the market. Because now each of these towns, thanks to port rights, effectively counts as a large city. And once I've granted the last right, I canonize one of my older rulers to restore legitimacy. Portugal appears on this list very quickly. Additionally, I demand trade power transfer from my colony, which immediately pushes me up to 2nd place, and I begin exporting as much gold as possible. Unfortunately, the quantities aren't very large yet, because trade routes are quite expensive to maintain. And to reduce those costs, along the entire coastline through which this route runs, in Moroccan territory, I built trade outposts. And I only needed those points so that I could now send a fleet to this coast, to patrol it and improve my maritime presence. Coincidentally, this happened around the same time that I invented better docks, and began building them everywhere. That's how I entered the Age of Discovery. Honestly, I don't really have a choice here and go down the diplomatic path, there are simply too many powerful bonuses to colonization, and the construction of major trade routes. In the third era, if you have a traditional economy, this law also becomes available. It allows you to extract more iron. So for now, I enact it. The gold from Mali starts flowing in, so I begin producing jewelry in several of my cities. At first, you need to disable automatic production method changes, because otherwise the market will automatically start importing even more gold. The quantities aren't large yet, but as maritime presence improves, they will continue to grow. I keep increasing trade capacity in Lisbon by building villages exclusively. After humanism, I further strengthen free subjects, and then the time finally comes for a capitalist economy. This is definitely the worst transition because it's really going to hit my wallet. To make it happen, I unfortunately need to increase my stability spending a bit, because I first have to revoke some burger privileges. And for every privilege I revoke, I replace it with one that increases capitalist economy values. I also switch employment methods to the most profitable ones first. Meanwhile, however, I continue discovering territories deeper in Africa, as well as preparing for another war around Benin. I've assembled a small professional army that will be supported either by levies or by mercenaries. Honestly, I don't have enough manpower to field a larger army. The war itself was surprisingly easy. I established a foothold here for future conquests. Shortly afterward, I unlocked the institution of the discovery of the New World. The situation here is actually quite simple. You just need to rush the technology that allows ocean exploration as quickly as possible. Next, I focus on burger laws in order to tax them less heavily, then the technology that speeds up discoveries, as well as the special unit available to Iberian countries, conquistadors. Only after that do I focus on increasing iron extraction, because you can never have too much iron. And only afterward do I collect all the bonuses for rapid colonization. These include both laws and straightforward bonuses. Especially important are these two cabinet actions. After conquering Benin, I can continue colonizing farther down the African coast. And these locations on the southwestern coast happen to have smaller populations, so I'll occupy these areas fairly quickly, and discovering the Congo allows me to push even farther south. At this point, I'm focusing more on exploration than on building the economy, because right now I don't have bonuses from either the traditional economy or the capitalist economy, so I'm suffering a bit because of that. Even so, I continue urbanization, turning towns into cities, because even in this era, I'm going to focus on mass production. And once I finally developed oceanic exploration, I honestly set that action to automatic mode, because there are still a great many routes ahead of me waiting to be discovered. However, for the goals I want to achieve with this Portugal, the most important thing for me is to invent new municipal laws that will allow city specialization as well as develop better paper mills, and essentially all second-tier upgrades. But it turned out that I still needed to obtain another government reform, because I received a unique Portuguese reform that increases my tax efficiency. And I still have this one reform left to enact at 50 points of capitalist economy. Specifically, it's the banking system and the modifier that significantly reduces trade costs. And there it is, I was the first in the world to discover the New World. Ha! Castile is probably calling me into its 20th war with Aragon by now, but I've had enough of that. Initially, I discovered the coast of Brazil. And I'm still taking advantage of the fact that I don't really have much else to spend my money on, so I go all in on discovering new locations. At the same time, I reached the southern coast of Africa, and I immediately sent colonists there. While I was finishing the conquest of Benin and my army was happily dying, it became time to choose my colonial policy. And I want to maximize migration as much as possible. Although Portugal also has its own unique law, it doesn't seem particularly good. And since my kingdom has finally entered the age of colonization, it's time to build new ports. Especially because I'm now reaching the eastern coast of Africa. Already I'm spending quite a lot on colonies, because I want to secure the western and southern coasts of Africa. But more importantly, I finally unlocked the cabinet action that allows me to accelerate colonization. And I intend to send settlers from Granada to this region. Unfortunately, in the latest patch, this action can no longer be stacked. In other words, one advisor can support only one colony, so you can forget about sending 1,000 settlers at once. Even so, after a few years I still have finished colonies that serve as a foothold for an attack on Zimbabwe. In this war, I'll be using mercenaries. This region is extremely important. There's a huge amount of gold and iron to acquire. Unfortunately, this country turned out to be too large to conquer in a single war, probably because I also occupied its ally. And now, exactly as before, I create a colonial nation here from the inland territories while keeping the coastal provinces for myself. This way, I still reduce my wealth after conquering new territories, because those inland lands are transferred to a vassal. And it's easier for me to keep the coastal locations as poor as possible, even though I'm about to build many towns there. And honestly, this is the best strategy I've developed so far, because it allows me to completely dominate markets without merely increasing wealth. I also immediately expand all iron and gold RGOs. If you think I could do something better here, let me know in the comments. Just before the year 1500, I developed the new municipal laws that allow me to specialize cities and towns. For example, Science will now focus on tool production because it has an iron mine, and I'll produce tools 30% more efficiently. And now, with the most important territories and markets in Africa secured, gold and other resources are flowing into Lisbon in huge quantities. I've developed a capitalist economy and unlocked new municipal laws that allow specialization. So I can move on to the next stage, in which I'll turn this little piece of Portugal into the richest country in Europe. Although even now I'm only slightly poorer than Castile. The route to India has been discovered, and I even received claims. It's just a shame that every one of these countries is still stronger than I am. What's even funnier is that I can't attack this country anyway, because it's outside my diplomatic range. So first, I set out to discover the Maldives. But more importantly, I've already specialized my cities. For example, I grant Lisbon the rights for jewelry production, which increases the number of buildings that can be constructed there. And I genuinely don't understand why all laws don't have something like this that increases those limits. And I won't hide it, my favorite law is the one for tool production. Although I can't wait until I unlock second-tier buildings, so I can make even more money from it. However, those only become available in the 4th era, after unlocking the institution of global trade. I've also discovered significant portions of Africa by now. And honestly, I'm facing a difficult choice. Should I go after the iron and gold in Africa or the gold and iron in South America? And honestly, for now, I've decided on Africa, because judging by how beautifully Zimbabwe is being colonized, for me, it might be a great idea to secure that entire region for Portugal. Although I think I might have some competition. In the war in the Congo, I'll also be using mercenaries. Well, the enemies don't stand a chance, especially since I have a lot of cavalry. Meanwhile, I've also acquired the Maldives. That has now enabled me to attack Goa. In this war, my strategy will simply be to wait until the allies abandon the country and then conquer it. With the development of improved paper technology, this event triggered. Who said bureaucracy is a bad thing? This form of government receives a 50% efficiency bonus, while simultaneously increasing my demand for paper by 100%. What more could you ask for? And honestly, I think this is probably the most powerful economic form of government I've ever seen. As a result, I don't really have a choice. And now several of my towns and cities will specialize in producing paper and books. I have a huge number of buildings to upgrade. And in the end, this business is incredibly profitable. Likewise, once I developed merchant quarters, I decided to build them in all of my towns and cities, which significantly increased market capacity in Lisbon, unfortunately at the cost of merchant power. In fact, I followed a very similar strategy in all of my most important markets, such as Niani, where I now completely dominate trade. And I'm even beginning to establish my presence in the powerful Indian market, which has allowed me to bring huge quantities of rare spices into Lisbon and then distribute them, look at this, across practically all of Europe. And I have to admit that over 200 years of gameplay, Portugal has undergone incredible changes, especially in terms of enriching its entire coastline. Although it's true that I'm not yet richer or more powerful than Castile, but I think this Portugal is already on the right path to significantly increasing its colonial power in South America over the next 100 years. And in the end, this business is genuinely very profitable. Although yes, competition has appeared here, I'll definitely need to push further into the markets of the Philippines, China and Japan. In fact, at this point, I have two main enemies. The first is population, which I'm struggling with in Lisbon, and that's despite the fact that my African colonies are actually supplying most of the settlers for Brazil at the moment. Because in order to accelerate colonization, I'm now selecting highly populated locations in Africa and using them to speed up the colonization of that region. The second problem is trade capacity. And unfortunately, trade costs as well. Even so, trade is currently my third most profitable source of income, only slightly behind taxes from merchants. If it weren't for exploration and colonization, I would have truly enormous monthly revenues, which would allow me to hire enough mercenaries to overwhelm Castile and conquer it. But whether I actually do that will be a topic for the next episode. And let me know in the comments how you'd like this story to continue. More historically, where I would now focus on conquering South America, Africa and establishing footholds in Asia, or would you prefer greater dominance in Europe? And if you want to learn exactly how to build a modern empire based on industry, trade and high control, then I recommend this guide.